Hello, classmates and professor. For my final paper, I have decided to focus on the Establishment Clause. The reason being is that I feel it is very applicable for all of us as Cornerstone students and staff because in our lives we have a strong conviction to our own faith, and unfortunately, the world we live in today doesn't really condone the combination of our religious beliefs and the workforce. We have to separate the two and often keep our mouth shut in order to protect our employment simply because in the world we live in today, anything about religion or politics can offend anybody. So I hope that you like what I have in store for you guys. So from our reading, we know that the Establishment Clause prohibits the government from establishing a state-sponsored religion, as well as from passing laws that promote religion or show a preference for one religion over the other. The biggest thing here is that it involves the separation of church and state, and even though it's not required, it is a very thin line. It's almost like the yo-yo effect, where you truly never know what the outcome of the case is going to be, because if a religious implementation also has a historical implementation, then it's kind of at a crossroads and it's up for the courts to decide. Much like a lot of the United States history, we can trace our roots back to England, and actually we go as far back to King Henry II, back in 1164. He wanted to pass a law that basically restricted the powers of the ecclesiastical courts. Um, a lot of times in England, members of the clergy had very lenient punishment when they were convicted of crimes, whereas laymen, on the other hand, were subject to the government jury where their crimes were dealt with pretty typical cruel punishments. The ecclesiastical courts were not allowed to spill blood. They took approach of excommunication and degradation over execution. This meant that very high-ranking officials, and at this point in history, bishops, held a substantially large role in England. They were, on their first offense, they were basically scot-free. At the worst, they would be degraded, such as tar and feathering or flogging, and at the worst, they were excommunicated from the church. King Henry II was not happy with this at all because essentially this meant that bishops were kind of untouchable. So he proposed that a law be passed so that either clergymen or laymen could be subject to the same punishment set forth by the government. In 1784, the United States government decided that they kind of needed to restructure the way that government was being held. There comes Bill number 82, a bill for establishing religious freedom. The issue here is even though the United States had already claimed its independence from England some 8 years earlier, the laws that were being followed were still implemented by King George and the Church of England, which was a very heavy Anglican-based country, which we would call Protestant today. So there wasn't a lot of influence from other religions. So a lot of the bills could come off as biased and improper treatment of the citizens of the United States. So in England, they have the House of Lords, which is the equivalent to the legislative branch in the United States today, which is composed of the Senate and the House of Representatives. Now, the House of Lords, there were 26 bishops that held a seat essentially in the House of Lords, and the other half were laymen who were elected or appointed into power. And essentially, the bishops had such a strong presence that if people didn't abide by what they were proposing, they were seen as blasphemers and going against the king's will, because it was actually the king back in the 1100s who appointed the Protestant or Anglican religion as the countrywide religion. So the bishop's word was essentially law. They were considered to be in high esteem. This bill received a lot of support, not only from those who were Protestant, but especially from the Presbyterians and Baptists, who had a very small, if not no presence at all in the government. The colonists did not want what was to be the United States to essentially be another representation of England. So a lot of the laws that had been in place were restructured, and the biggest one is that this bill laid the foundation for the First Amendment. Even though there was a separation of church and state, we still see the very fine line in trying to figure out where do we draw it. In the early 1960s, the case of Engel versus Vitale arises. And this arose in New York State because the New York State government had proposed what they thought at the time was a essentially religious neutral prayer that acknowledged one God and was non-denominational that everybody would essentially be on board with. Stephen Engel was not a religious man. He was actually a parent of one of the students, and he felt that it was inappropriate that his child had to say the word God in the classroom. So he went after the school board, and particularly William Vitale, who had the most authoritative position at the time, and it went from the New York State Court to the appeal courts all the way up to the Supreme Court, and eventually it was ruled in a 7-1 voting that in this country it is no part of the business of the government to compose official prayers for any group of the American people. So this is where we really start to see government-sponsored schools to not only not be required to say any sort of state-mandated prayer, but it also paves the way for the Pledge of Allegiance to be taken out of the picture simply because of the fact that it does mention God, even though it is a non-denominational proclamation to our independence. 57 years later, we're still running into the separation of church and state. And there's an ongoing case right now that started in February of 2019, and it involves the American Legion versus the American Humanist Association. What it's over is that in Maryland in 1925, a 40-foot cross paying homage to those who served in World War I was erected, and it just so happened to be placed in the middle of a traffic circle. Well, nowadays that traffic circle is a public park which is owned by the government. The humanists are claiming that the cross promotes Judeo-Christian land, is on government paid for property, and is forcing people to essentially accept the values of the Judeo-Christian religion. Thanks for watching. There is a lot of history behind the Establishment Clause, and this was really just the tip of the iceberg. I could give a presentation on the history for hours and hours, but I really hope that I was able to shed some light on the history of the Establishment Clause and why our country is shaped the way that it is today. I look forward to seeing what you guys have as well.